So first of all, just to say that this event is part of a research seminar series hosted by the Centre for Religion and Society at York St John University. The centre was founded in 2008 as a forum where scholars, practitioners, policymakers, people from all sorts of sectors, both academia and in different organisations within various aspects of society, where we can come together and talk and discuss and consider issues of the role of religion in the cultural, social and political life of society, as well as its role in conflict, peace building and reconciliation. So that's a little bit about the centre. And at the heart of the work of the centre is the commitment to social justice and equality. So that runs through predominantly so much of our work. If you'd like to find out more about our centre and what we're doing, then you can go to our website and blog, which you can find at blog.yorksj.ac.uk/CRIS/. If you Google us, you'll find us. So first of all, I'm Pauline Collin-Tighe. I'm Professor Emerita at York St John, working in the area of religion, peace and conflict. Now then, much more important than me are our two panellists, and I'd like now to introduce them. So something just briefly about who they are and what they're doing. So first, Ruby Quanson-Davis. Welcome, Ruby. Ruby is a peace and development researcher stroke practitioner with nearly 20 years of global experience in public policy, research and advocacy, deliberative conversations, community engagement, and institutional development. She has worked extensively within Africa and the South Pacific, Israel, and the United States. She currently serves as a senior learning and impact advisor at Peace Direct, the international charity in London. She is also an associate member of Wesley House in Cambridge, UK, a faculty member of the Deliberative Democracy Institute, where she was a former fellow and resident scholar of the Kettering Foundation in Ohio in the United States. So welcome, Ruby. We look forward to this session with you. And our second panelist is Shannon Page. Welcome, Shannon. Shannon is a policy associate at Peace Direct in Washington, DC. So she's zooming in, as one might say, from Washington, around about lunchtime, I think, isn't it there? And Shannon leading efforts on issues including decolonizing aid and peace building, improving local ownership in peace processes, and developing Peace Direct's US peace building program. Shannon facilitates conversations on the platform for dialogue and contributes to developing educational materials on the Global Peace Building Act. Prior to that, Shannon worked with Peace Direct as a Scoville Peace Fellow. She has also worked with several small international non-profit organisations, most recently at New Light, a non-profit-based organisation in Kolkata, or Calcutta, as I should say, in India, that works with migrant sex workers. So it's great to have you as well, Shannon, here with us this evening, and to hear your work and your thoughts and your ideas and experiences about building inclusive communities. So I'm going to kick off, and I'm going to ask our speakers to start to think with us about some issues and questions, and then as your questions and issues come in as well, we will feed those in. And first of all, I wanted to get your views and thoughts about why building inclusive communities is so important. And what are the major problems in trying to do this? So, over to you.
Thank you so much, Pauline, and thank you to all our participants for joining this conversation. It's hard to join any conversation these days without getting a sense of somebody feeling left out. And it's hard to watch the news or, you know, be in any gathering without getting that sense of exclusion or people not feeling that they belong. And we can see this at various levels. You know, is it the global immigration problem? You can find it. Is it the race issue? Is it injustice? Is it gender? Is it healthcare, education? So there is nowhere that we don't feel and see and sense that a lot of people are feeling quite disconnected. And so it's a very critical issue because it has implications for the kind of world we live in, the kind of societies we build, and the kind of policies we make, you know. And so it's important to take a moment to say, what is it that makes people feel disconnected? And it is that inquiry that can perhaps help us to create the kind of world we want to live in. And I just need to say upfront that some of this conversation sometimes sounds so idealistic, but actually I'm hoping that by the time we get to the end of this, we could see how practical this is and how each of us could work towards it, because these affect us. Shannon, do you want to weigh in first?
Please, and I will say I am an idealist, and so I hope that while we do have some practical solutions, I think it is important to remain optimistic when we're talking about this, because to your point, Ruby, so often when we are talking about inclusion, we are really talking about exclusion, and we are really often talking about the ways that people approach this conversation is often from a place of defensiveness and needing to assert themselves and feeling like if they don't do it, nobody else will, and feeling unseen and unheard and undervalued, really. And so when you and I were thinking about what would it look like to have a conversation about inclusivity and inclusive communities specifically, I think what we were really talking about is what kind of world are we trying to live in? I think a number of us, because of the pandemic and because of other larger issues that have been happening, have found ourselves retreating. Our lives have gotten very small in many ways. Our circles have gotten very small, and our circles have, for many people, gotten very homogenous. And so when we're thinking about inclusivity, as we start to slowly be in relationship with one another again in the old ways and also in some new ones, how can we make sure that we are creating spaces where as broad a scope of people can join? And why is that important? I think that's also something that we need to be asking ourselves here today. Why is that something that we value? What are the implications if we don't?
Perhaps I could just say a little bit more about that. What are the real key implications if we're unable to enhance, improve, develop more inclusive communities?
I might start, seeing as I'm based in the United States, and we are in a period of really incredible polarization. There is a fundamental inability currently here for people to speak to one another and to take a breath and to truly listen. There are so many assumptions. And so I will speak to what that looks like. It looks like meetings that are striving towards peace building, that are talking about what does justice and equity look like in this country, where just I show up, and because I am a Black woman, or somebody else shows up and because they are a white man, we have been taught to believe that we know what the other person is going to say before they even open their mouth. And there's no way for us to actually build the necessary trust or even just basic respect for us to be able to give and collaborate in the ways that are necessary for true justice and equity and peace. And so oftentimes I'm entering into spaces where I would consider some of the most brilliant minds of this country, people who are genuinely committed to a better America, and yet there is an inability to do something because we have been trained to believe that we know the other without actually allowing them to introduce themselves to us. And so I think for me, I'm seeing that in real time. And so that's a really big challenge. We can't create policy together because we can't build coalitions, because we can't be in community with one another. And, you know, we are unwilling to allow people to learn as well. We assume that if people get something wrong, that means something fundamental about them, or if we get something wrong, that means something fundamental about who we are as people. And it all becomes incredibly existential, incredibly fast. And there's no space to take a breath, to say, hi, what do you think? What are you learning? What are you unsure of? What are you trying to work towards, and how can I work with you? We don't have those conversations, or we're learning to, and we're trying to, but we're not very good at it. And so there are real practical implications and challenges that emerge when we are unable to think about building these inclusive communities and viewing one another as people first, rather than whatever various identities we may have.
Ruby, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, and I do want to get back to the thought around how we have these conversations in a minute, but just want to also sort of situate and contextualize this a little bit at different levels. So, you know, we can connect to it, because I've been places where people kind of feel, you know, we all kind of feel we're doing it right, and we're building these inclusive communities because we do the family gathering, and we had Thanksgiving, and everybody came, and it's Christmas, and we send our gifts. But just to deconstruct this a little bit is the fact that some of these are happening at very personal levels. So this is the family level. And then some of this, and I worked extensively in Africa, and I worked in certain very remote places, in other places, and know that even at the village level, there is some kind of disintegration happening. And this is important to highlight, because if you speak to especially indigenous groups, they will tell you that they inherently had certain ways and approaches and way of life of connecting. So what is it that is making people feel disconnected at that level, the village level? So that micro level I want to put on the table. And then there is the national level. And we know that our national politics, regardless of the country you live in, our national politics enjoys an interaction with the rest of the world. And so it's heavily influenced by the external. So that space of your national policies, which ideally should be informed by our local interaction and decision-making, is heavily influenced by the external. So there is a place, there's an interface where a disconnect is happening along the way. And we can give examples as we go. And then, of course, within the international arena, we know that there are powers at all levels, and there are many ways in which those powers manifest. And so I want to put those levels on the table, but I also want to make it clear that what we're talking about is also a power game, and it's a power dynamic that is going on. And sometimes it becomes a survival of the fittest unless we do the interventions we're talking about. And I think it's the interventions that perhaps will take us to how we talk about this, but I just really wanted to kind of surface those levels more strongly.
Thanks. So what are some of the ways in which that sense of exclusion is experienced? You've mentioned some of briefly, but could you say a little bit more about that? And to what extent has COVID exacerbated the situation as well?
That's important. And I'm just going to start that, and Shannon will step in as well. In the last couple of weeks, I've been part of facilitated two conversations. One is with a group of people, and the conversation was themed navigating difficult conversations. So when we started as a small faculty leading this process, we were interested in, why do you want to broach the subject, navigating difficult conversations? And this is a group of people, I think age group will be perhaps 30-something to maybe 65. So it's a whole range. And that is really interesting that we've got this. So perhaps not exactly very youthful or young people. But the point being that the examples coming out of this conversation just showed people's personal stories of how they do not feel they can intervene in certain spaces. It was striking to see that some of this happened at the dinner table. I don't feel that. So it was really, and I hope that panelists can relate to that. That, you know, there is, we don't want to name relatives, okay, but there is that person who you think you can't get a conversation going. But there were also a lot of examples institutionally, which for me was really exciting, because I think sometimes when we talk about conflicts, we think about conflict as those countries over there in those lands that we don't have to deal with. But these are interpersonal conflicts that happen at the family level and in institutional levels. And also to kind of talk about that a little more, the institutional level challenges and exclusion, as you would expect, has to do with power, and has to do with positions, and has to do with recognition and acceptance. So a lot of people who shared in these spaces were basically saying, I'm working in a place where I don't feel valued. And how is it that, and for us as a faculty, probing this further and sort of feeding it with the necessary theory, but also the practice, how is it that you don't feel valued when you were recruited for that position? What is it that is missing? Where is the feedback loop? So those are very practical things. But the second conversation were with graduate students between the US and South Africa. And it was interesting that to see that these were mainly, you know, late teenage and early 20s. And to see them struggling with how to get into conversations without being shut off. So what is it that's going on with the world that everybody at different level feeling? I don't want to be shut off. I'm feeling like I don't belong. My identity is challenged. My thoughts are questioned. My integrity is undermined. And this is what is, I think this for me, dwelling in these two examples concurrently in a 4-week period was quite instructive. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Shannon, did you want to add anything?
Please, I think really you've mentioned power a number of times now, and I'm so struck by that, because I think what it sounds like I'm hearing from these experiences that you had and what I'm witnessing in a number of places that I'm in is this sense that everybody feels disempowered. It doesn't matter their positionality or their identities, everybody feels disempowered to a degree to be fully themselves and to really assert themselves and their opinions in spaces. And, you know, back to what I previously mentioned is this defensiveness, but there is a sense that there's this struggle that's going on, and whether or not they have the ability or whether or not that's welcomed for them to voice their opinions. And it's fascinating to watch that this is happening across age groups, across racial groups and ethnic groups and religious and people of different faith backgrounds. It is really telling to me that it doesn't seem to matter who's speaking. Everybody is feeling the same sense of not belonging, the same sense of being disempowered. And I'm really, really wondering, what does that actually look like to combat that? You know, I think we talk a lot about inclusivity. I mean, DEI is one of the things that I think, following the year that we had last year, I know a number of organizations have made numerous DEI commitments. And we're talking about diversity, we're talking about equity, but that last part, that inclusion, we have the people of different backgrounds, we have the policies in place, but we're not capturing the sense, that intangible sense of what it means to belong. And I think part of it is, do people feel that they wield power? And what does that look like? And can you wield power without wielding it against somebody else? And is that maybe what people are sensing, is that it's no longer appropriate to wield your power, you know, to the detriment of the other person? And then that creates a hesitancy. So how can we shift that? Because I think there is a power in the collective And so how can we really start to engage with one another from that perspective, rather than I need to assert myself and you need to assert yourself, and then there's a power struggle that's ongoing. That's just something that I'm really reflecting on, because it is detrimental in the long term for people to continuously feel this disconnected, this disempowered. And it is going to lead, and is leading in many ways, to a closing in on themselves and people who in many ways directly reflect their own positionalities back to them. And that isn't something that I think any of us want to see on this call. In fact, the opposite. And so how can we create spaces that don't cause people to feel so removed, so disconnected after being in them, that they retreat?
And so oh, sorry, Ruby.
Oh, just wanted to kind of weigh in a couple of things that Shannon touched on. No, I don't think suffering can be compared. When people are suffering, we don't say your suffering is bigger than mine. But to some extent, I think it's also worth kind of highlighting that people are feeling disconnected and disempowered, and as you said, to different degrees, because some have felt it historically and so deeply ingrained and so repetitive and generational, that it's important to highlight that if one is going to make any effort into changing things. So when you have a group of people in the room, I think whilst often we say we don't want to dwell on the past, I think it has implications for how you treat that problem or how you deal with that problem. So yes, we can compare the suffering, but I think some people have just had a lot more. And Pauline, you talked about, you mentioned COVID, for instance. I think one thing that we said a lot last year is that COVID has revealed the inequalities that existed. So yes, it has aggravated it, but also has revealed some of it. So when we see gender disparities, they existed before. When we see racial injustices, they were there before. And then we got to COVID, and it was clear who could access vaccines, for instance, and who couldn't, and for what reasons. And if you look at the US, the kind of, you could map it out, the kind of communities that couldn't access and so on and so forth. And those are rather historical, aren't they? And so we are at a place where, we are in a crisis that is feeding on previous maybe issues that we overlooked.
So can I move you into your experience and ideas and approaches to how do you see what the roles are of, well, ordinary citizens, public institutions, organizations, religious groups? What can they do? Do you have some examples, for example, where some of these different individuals and organizations, groups are actually helping to create the space to start promoting and building many more inclusive communities?
Go ahead, Shannon.
I will say that, as a young person, a lot of the ways that I'm seeing this happen, especially because of the pandemic, online. I think the communities that are being built online are absolutely fascinating. And I am witnessing, especially I think in the summer of 2020, during the racial uprisings here in the United States, I was in spaces on Discord channels where there were people who were from very conservative families, white people from very conservative families in the United States asking, I don't get it. This, seeing police brutality in this particular way is completely transgressing everything that I've been taught and everything that I understood. And they were feeling really lost. And I think for a lot of people of color, specifically Black Americans, there was very little patience in many other spaces to hold that confusion that many white Americans were feeling last year for the first time, because I think there was, to Ruby's point, not all suffering is equal, but for a community that was actively feeling targeted, it was really difficult to then say, how have you not seen? We've been saying this for so many years. And also, this, for many conservative white people who grew up in this country and who were told a certain thing about what the police did and the role that the police had to the general populace, it was earth-shattering. And so it was really fascinating because in person, because of COVID and because of the tensions of the country, people were coming together and there were many, many violent skirmishes. And then I would go onto this Discord, I would go on TikTok or various other social media discussion threads, and I would see people asking questions and I would see people answering in good faith and really taking the time to share links and explain things and expand on things. And I think there was a grace that we don't traditionally associate with online anonymous discussion, but there was a real grace for the hurt that both parties were feeling. And again, I want to be clear, I'm not equating those feelings, but I am saying there was an ability to recognize that both parties were hurting, even if that hurt looked different, came from different places, etc. And so I think that's, what does it look like to try and recreate some of those spaces in real life? Well, I don't know that the pandemic is going to allow us to do that just yet. But in terms of formal institutions, I think one thing that's been really heartening is seeing the ways that a number of faith communities have been inviting people to talk about racism and racial justice in this country. And so, thinking about the ways that a lot of Muslim communities here in the United States and Jewish communities in the United States, as well as Christian communities, are saying, like, actually, our religion calls us to be active on this point. And so there are coalitions that are forming that are faith-based and that are, they have very different perspectives on policies oftentimes have very different backgrounds, and yet they are committed. And I think, to me, what has helped build the sense of inclusion is that shared respect and also shared cause. I think oftentimes, especially when it's somebody that is very, very different and we are still trying to understand them, having a shared cause to work towards, that I've seen, that has been the most effective way to really start to disregard some of our identity differences and, allow them to not be barriers, but rather just facts. And I think that's quite heartening for me to think that if we have a shared goal, we can work towards that. Now, the question then is, how can we have more shared goals and more spaces? But
yeah, Shannon, you said it, you are eternally hopeful, and I like that you brought that positivity into the conversation, so it's not all doom and gloom. But pardon me if I had to go back to your question, Pauline, on why inclusive communities, because I think that is the question that leads us to what must be done, or what are we doing and how are we doing it. And, the argument, at least around which I work, is if you have a population of a country or a village or a community, you want to cater to and for that community. But we have learned over the years in our work that the state alone cannot do that. It's not great saying it's in the UK, is it? But if there is anything we know, that the state has failed us in many ways across the years in history. So we have every reason as ordinary people, institutions, and so on to step in. Now, some have argued that that step in could get the state off the hook, but I don't think so. I think, somebody put out a post that politics is too serious a matter to leave to politicians. So if that is anything to go by, and if politics is defined and operationalized as the choice making, the things that concern us, the things that bother us, the things that affect our lives, and we want to do something about them, I don't want to leave that to a politician. However, there are roles for the state to play. And I have found in my work that where citizens have been active, part of being active is putting the states and state agencies on their toes, as well as other institutions. And so coming from that angle that we do need ordinary citizens to be part of decision-making, policy-making processes. And it in itself, and I only talk about what had actually been done, what we have done over the years in many countries, is it's inherently empowering when somebody feels like they made a decision about their way of life. and they then get to deal with the trade-offs and the responsibility that comes with. So if I look at it from that angle, Shannon mentioned faith-based organization, and this is where we are in your institution. I think, when I look at populations in like Africa, Latin America, the South Pacific, especially among the small island countries, my argument is that these are what you may call religious regions. More, when you look at the South Pacific, especially, Oceania, more than 90% of populations are Christians, for instance. Mm-hmm. And they're very serious about their faith matters and go to the places of worship regularly. So if the bulk of the citizenry go to these spaces regularly, what can those institutions do to enable those, that citizenry to act? So I find it a bit troubling when faith-based organizations do a hands-off, because part of what I'm calling the decision-making and all of that is seen to be politics. And I think what they mean is partisan politics, which of course has been dirtied in many ways. But the point is, we are sitting with a citizenry, the largest number, I often say, in parts of Africa, with the exception of occasional elections, general elections, the church attracts more crowds than any other gathering. I mean, not even musical concerts. So these institutions of faith ought to be engaged and ought to engage in building these inclusive communities. And again, in these communities that I've cited, traditionally the church or the places of worship were places of refuge. So if people in these spaces say we feel excluded and we think we can put all of that on the government, there is a problem. Because when the government fails us, we need to be able to come to some other safe space. And that part of what we're talking about feeling included is being in a safe space and being a safe community. So I find that disconnect a bit disheartening, that people can, give their monies to some of these faith institutions and not be able to do it. And I guess linked to that is the educational institutions, which also reach out to a whole lot of people. And so where is that change going to happen if educational institutions don't look at the curriculum, syllabus, who is teaching, what is it for, who are we churning out? I think we need to be brave to look at that. And I know that's not easy. It's not easy in the academy or academia. It's not easy even in primary schools. But I think those are places where we need to have this conversation. People need to leave these institutions feeling empowered, not leaving and feeling disconnected and to go back. And of course, I'll be the first to mention INGOs and NGOs, which has also been my world for a long time. And I think, and perhaps Shannon can speak to that more, but I think with today talking about decolonizing development, because the way that we have done it has only been a perpetuation of the inequalities and the injustices that have come from our history. So if we're talking about what can be done, I think all of us who kind of are the, we want to do good. I know it comes from a good place, charity and philanthropy. We need to question those things. We need to look at our approaches to philanthropy, for instance. I mean, when philanthropy creates dependence and creates a savior syndrome and creates we need to look at that and we need to name them. And I'm going to have Shannon weigh in before I come back to the part of the how.
I mean, I think
before you come in, Shannon, just to remind people that you can put your questions into the question and answer box, and I think we've got one. But Shannon, please continue.
I think I want to problematize a little bit about what you were saying of some of these institutions, Ruby, because there's so much opportunity for example, religious institutions, for educational institutions, for the philanthropy sector in general to be arms for building these inclusive communities. And again, let's root ourselves in history. Historically, the three branches that you've pulled out, I can speak at length at the ways that the philanthropy sector in particular has promoted Exclusion has promoted hierarchies rooted in notions of class and race and gender and all of the things. And so, let's also talk about religious institutions. To this day, religious institutions continue to be forces of exclusion. And I am not even getting as expansive as talking about people of different faith backgrounds interacting within the same faith community. We are looking at what happens if you are unwed in a Christian community and you fall pregnant. What happens there? Is there room for you? Is there room for your child? Historically, no. And today, still in many communities, that isn't true. If you are a member of the LGBT community, how has your religious tradition been in a space for inclusion for you? I think, and there are some really ugly things in the history of these institutions. They have wielded a lot of power, a lot of money, and because they have had such access to people, they have shaped our societies. And so a lot of the divisions that we are now wrestling with and that are being exacerbated in large part because of COVID, they are not new. Like you said, Ruby, they are not new. And some of their origins do come from these institutions that it's ironic, but these are also the institutions that have the potential to fix them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, looking at the educational system, how many people know that from the second you are pregnant, you are trying to find the right preschool to put your child in? Because I have heard from so many people that you put your child in that preschool and that's going to give them privileged access to this elementary school, which is going to give them privileged access to so on and so forth as they move up the system. I have heard from people who are 6 months pregnant that they have their child unborn on lists, and this is not unusual, but that's class. From that child isn't even born, and we are already structuring what environments, what communities they're going to be a part of, and what communities they are not. And for the parents who do not have the ability or the knowledge or the access to put those children on those lists, instantly we have already excluded their unborn children. So I think, we really need to sit with the fact that while these institutions do hold such potential, they have caused so much harm. And the changes that we are asking go beyond even the curriculum. It goes beyond, occasionally allowing a couple of students who are on scholarship to attend incredibly expensive and prestigious schools. It goes beyond that because a singular person's inclusion doesn't dismantle the inherent exclusivity of the system. In fact, it reinforces it. And so how can we think more expansively? How can we think, if we truly fundamentally believe that, faith spaces have the ability to be caring and nurturing and challenging and really calling people to be their best selves and to live out the best ideals of their own religion, what does that actually look like? And how can we ensure, as members of various faith communities, how can we ensure that the faith community that we're in is doing that? How can we ensure when we're in educational spaces that, the educational spaces that we're in is also genuinely accessible and inclusive and so much, even just thinking about education, the language that we use, the register of language that we use, the way that we expect people to comport themselves. Deportment is such a way to exclude people. And we don't even process it. We don't think about it, but it's the small things that we have normalized as class markers or, markers of who does and doesn't belong. So, and then, just to go back to philanthropy, we're talking about decolonizing, and the philanthropy sector, I think, is in many ways similar to the faith sector, like faith-based institutions and those communities, because the aim is to do good. Nobody enters philanthropy thinking that they are going to, well, I will assume that most people don't enter philanthropy with the assumption that they are going to assert themselves over others. And because they are white and attended, either an Ivy League if we're on my side of the pond or Oxbridge if we're on yours, that there's something about them that is fundamentally better equipped to resolve whatever issue. And yet that's how the sector works. The sector is rooted in notions that those in, North America and Europe are fundamentally better suited and better equipped to guide those in the rest of the world, in the majority world, or global South, if you prefer, like in the rest of the world, to some sort of quote unquote promised land that they are going to be able to reach a degree of civilization, and then they will be included. Then they will have access to all of the things we have access to. And it's a fabrication. These institutions as they stand are intentionally exclusionary. They are built to be that way. And so we're talking about building inclusive communities. What we're really talking about, at least to me, is we're talking about looking at these communities that we're in, looking at these institutions and saying, let's build something new. And not to say that we need to completely separate ourselves from our history, of course not. There are many beautiful things in the history of all three of these sectors that we've mentioned. But it does mean that we are trying to build something different. And that is not something that I think is easy to recognize, but it is necessary.
Thank you for those thoughts and ideas, and obviously based on your working experiences, both of you. I have a couple of questions coming now from our audience. First one is from William Tolbert, and I will read this. Power is so much connected to leadership. And both of you have mentioned power a lot so far in this discussion. In Africa, I feel much of the peace problem arises due to gaps on leadership. But until and unless values and ethics are integrated with leadership, no progressive peace will be realized. So what is the strategy that can be used to raise empowering leaders in the context of Africa, so as to reduce conflict zones like in Ethiopia, Somali, Sudan, and other areas of the world, actually, and nations affected by conflict? But so this is a question is about power, leadership. How do we create leaders who are ethical, and what strategy to raise empowering leaders? So I'll give it over to you.
I will start. I mean, the question mentions Africa, and I'm passionate about that, because one of my own inquiries in writing is, what is leadership in different places and contexts? So for the time that I've worked in an democratic elections, particularly democratic elections, because that's what we've had to do to rebuild our systems, and most of African countries in a post-structural adjustment era, returning to constitutional rule and all of that, is being democratic governance. The question we're asking now is there a bit of a tension between whatever it is that we have called democratic governance and what leadership meant in Africa? If you speak about the ethnic groups and tribes, if I take, for instance, the Akans of Ghana, and I take, for instance, the Ashantis, the hierarchy is very clear in their system about who rules. Those systems are well respected, regarded, because people do get their turn. And yes, occasionally we will hear some chieftaincy disputes. And it's amazing how that is blown up in other parts of the world, as if we don't get that in our parliaments in different places when people are about to beat each other up. So that was happening. When we introduced democratic governance, which obviously was supposed to enhance things and include more people, because of course what we have said was that the traditional governance systems did not include the broader community. I mean, that's not true, but I'm not going to go into that in this conversation. The only thing is it did not align with what democratic governance was. I think when we pose that question, we are settled with democratic governance as it's come. But what is powerful is that democratic governance, which we do need now, can be contextualized to suit people. And so to the questioner's point, is it the disconnect that is affecting our leadership? Have we mapped it on wrongly? To the point that, we're forcing, is it square pegs in round holes, that we're struggling with that. I think every culture especially I can speak to, indigenous cultures, they do have systems of governance, and it is time to examine those. And certainly there are aspects of it that are not appealing any longer, that do not serve the purpose, especially issues around gender and so on. But even those issues, could we take a moment to understand the rationale for it and see how human interpretation has sort of, messed that up, and perhaps we can change it. So I think in Africa, some of that disconnect has happened, and coupled with the hardships of the continent and all of that, we're really struggling. But it's difficult to talk about this without talking about the resources that still exist in the continent that can still make a difference. And I want to link that to the questioner's point on Ethiopia, Sudan, and Somalia. I mean, which kinds of conflicts does the world intervene in or help with? And we can look at the trend. Where the world chooses to support conflict and make that conflict end, it's been quite selective. So we are sitting here with Ethiopia going through what is going on. I don't quite see the international community's commitment to Ethiopia. I don't see that, and this is exactly what happened. We sat here and let Rwanda happen. So we're talking about exclusion here, exclusion in policies, in foreign policies that are geared towards, parochial interest. And this is why I kind of feel that, yes, the leadership disconnect is there. And as the questioner said, we need to feed it again with our values, ethos or ethics. We need to feed it, because it's not so much about rejecting democratic governance, whichever way it's come from the West. I don't even think it came from the West, because as I said, there were systems of governance. Communities were having conversations. Communities were finding ways to vote. I have recently observed the elections in Gambia, and I was just amazed how kind of almost basic, traditional way of counting pebbles. And I know it will sound strange to some people because we've got all these electronic ways and posting and all of that. But for me, it was really refreshing to see that they use their own systems, because your own system can be empowering, So I just think I agree that we do need to kind of bring back our ethos and our I would say the aspects of people's culture that worked, because when the framing of leadership resonates with people, they can connect to it. For now, we're struggling with the framing of leadership that seem to be alien.
Shannon?
I think Ruby covered it beautifully. I would only like to add, when we think about leadership, I think we have a tendency, and forgive me, William, I won't assume that this is a belief that you have, so I'm using the royal we, but I think generally we think, oh, there are gaps in leadership in Africa. There are gaps in leadership in Asia. That's why there are these conflicts. And if only we could help them, develop their sense of leadership and really make sure that their leadership is ethical and values-based. And I don't think that's wrong, but I do wonder, do we have examples of ethical leadership in Europe? Do we have examples of ethical leadership in the United States? Are there no gaps in leadership in the United States? Is the will of the people properly represented? Can we say that there's no conflict? I'm not challenging the question, but I am challenging what we look to as leadership, what we understand leadership to be, and the ways that we, even, to your point, Ruby, the lack of commitment from the international community to Ethiopia, there is also a lack of commitment from the international community to many other conflicts around the world that we will never recognize as conflicts. And because to recognize those situations and circumstances as a conflict would be to recognize certain gaps of leadership, certain unmet standards, and certain unethical practices that is fundamentally in disconnect with how we have conceptualized of certain nations. And so I think it is more complicated than that. And I think even when we're thinking about where we're choosing to put our attention, that's really important when we're talking about inclusion, and really important when we're talking about who's a part of this global system. If we're holding everybody to account, if we truly view ourselves as being like a global community that is responsible for the safety and well-being of every human, that includes humans in France. are they safe? I mean, maybe yes, but are we asking these questions?
Okay, so another question here. This is from Brownie. While religion has been responsible for causing war and divisions in society, do you think world peace, world unity is ever possible through religion? There we go, the multi-billion-dollar question, of which so many of us at the Centre for Religion and Society, and I know in other institutions and amongst policymakers and NGOs and in religious communities, that question. So what are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, it's interesting because, Pauline, I think this would go to you and your department and your school and everything as well. And for as long as your school continues to exist, this question would be relevant. I can look into what I can only speak to what I've looked into and through my own research. And as I said before, when I looked at these two regions of Africa and the South Pacific, so my argument is that these are the people who are impacting people's lives on a daily basis. And it's important to say upfront that this experience will be different for different regions. There are certain parts of the world where, I remember there are times going to church and I kind of wonder, why is the church so empty? And this is maybe as far back as 2002 in like London. And I was like, why is it so empty? Because I'd come from traditions where Sunday service is 600 people, 1,000 people, 1,500 people. So this is how I build that argument that if we're going to get people, let's go to where they are. And I tried this with a team, with a think tank I worked with in Ghana, and this was in maybe 2012, and saying our communication strategy should target the church. Where are the people? They're in the church, they're in the mosques. And our platforms brought together religious leaders and in an interfaith way to say, we cannot leave governments alone and parliaments alone to make decisions. And we cannot do this as civil society alone. So as a civil society organization and think tank and research organization, we provided, if you will, the technical backstopping for, getting policy briefs written and all of that. But it was important to work through these revered persons in our communities, because they were still revered, so whether I was a cardinal or whether I was the imam, it was important to draw them in. I do know that from that work and 4 years after that, that brought some weight to the policy briefs that we were putting out. And I know there are people in regions who would listen to no one, but they would listen to their pastors. And so we recently, the wonderful theologian in Ghana and women's advocate and lawyer, Angela Abuaji, wrote a book on women's mental health and talking about how their first point of call were their pastors. And so part of this was to say, if we're going to deal with mental health, we need to create some interaction between the medical field and these places of faith, because that's where people go. They're not stupid. People are looking for places that they feel safe. And we can't argue about that. But the point is, when we talk about peace and health and well-being, in many places, their faith and their religions impact them on a daily basis. And I know this is not the same in most parts of Europe and so on. So I'm not touching on that. But even then, when you talk to people, on a personal note, within them, there are certain connections that you can't touch. And so would that bring peace? I certainly don't see how we pursue peacemaking and peace building without faith-based organizations.
I think there's also a really common narrative in many parts of Europe and very many secular spaces in the United States as well, where we talk about religion as a problem exclusively. And when we're talking about religion like that, I think not only do we overlook the power and relevance that formalized religion has for millions of people across the world today still, but we also are viewing religion through a prism that I think is fundamentally Abrahamic. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is to say that there are religions that are not Abrahamic religions. And so, being based in the United States, I think it's been my responsibility to learn a little bit about the various indigenous communities that were originally on this land. And a lot of the ways that they engage with, they might not use the term religion, but their faith background is one that understands themselves to be fundamentally connected to the land and to their communities. And so when it comes to like being in a space, it isn't just who I am, Shannon, in this space, it's who I am, Shannon, and the trees on this land and the earthworms and everything. And there is this reciprocity that is built in. And so if you have that perspective, if you have this reciprocal perspective, then protecting the land, defending your fellow human, all of those things are built in for certain communities. And now that isn't to, romanticize, but it is to say that we need to also understand that not every religion exists in the same way. And for many religions, fundamentally, peace, understanding, listening to one another, learning are integral to the ways that they function. And so I think while yes, religion is an absolute necessity in the sense that it brings solace and is a way to access so many communities and lend legitimacy to what we're saying and peace building efforts, I also want to say not every religion functions the same. And we really need to understand that there is nothing about religion inherently that makes it dangerous. It is the ways that it has been co-opted and used. And so how can we really allow for it to exist in really like recognize the value of it without demeaning it and saying, well, it's uniquely a path to violence is just something that I'm seeing a lot in more Western spaces. And I just wanted to problematize it a little bit.
And perhaps to add to that quickly, it's also the thing about, I think in the literature and in perhaps in the academy, there is a sense that, and even for us practitioners talking about spaces where we talk, there is a sense that people have to leave their faith systems outside the door. And it's hard for people to do that because in the communities that I've talked about and that you talked about, faith or religion or whatever, faith system and culture and everyday cultural practices are very linked. So any process that kind of forces people to delink the two excludes them because they can find a language to come to it. So I'm glad you have kind of highlighted that because it's the interconnectivity with everything around people and that impacts their daily lives. And so whether we're talking about peace, whether we're talking about better education or healthcare, for many people, this has to be seen within a bigger context.
If I could just briefly add something to what you were saying, because it is about recognizing that religions operate ways in which texts are interpreted in different geopolitical historical contexts, and that there is a dual nature to religion. It can be holy war in a destructive sense, culture, or it can be a peace building and reconciliation culture that promotes these things. So I think those are very important things, and those are the things that you're saying, is to really get people to look at the positive and see the positive, as well as recognizing how destructive religion can be. So we have another question here. So this is Dr. Ayla Gull. She's one of our colleagues at York St. John. So do you think the international community is part of the problem or part of the solution in working towards building inclusive communities? And basically, in short, what can the international community do?
Both. I think the international community continues to be a problem, and also international community means nothing and everything. Right now I'm across the pond. This is an international community that we have built. I am the international community to you and vice versa. And also, let's engage with your question in a serious way. If we are talking about the United Nations, if we are talking about, the relationship that countries have with one another, that's a separate thing to thinking about the ways that I might exist and have relationships with, as an immigrant in the United States, like the relationships that I have with my family back in the Caribbean and Trinidad and Barbados. that's an international community that exists as well. The diaspora is part of the international community, and the relationship that those and the opportunities that those have are very, very different. And so I want to be clear that international community covers a multitude of relationships that exist internationally. And I don't think we have the time or ability to parse through all of them, but just some broad strokes. I think for me, there is the most opportunity in the interpersonal. I think the interpersonal is political. I think it is absolutely mobilizing in a way, having somebody whose face you recognize, whose name you know, and be able to point to them. I think there is nothing but opportunity there for building a community. And so whether that can, and I think in that sense, diaspora communities are so powerful. They have there's so much opportunity for building these inclusive communities through them, the ways that they are connected. I think similarly, a lot of faith communities that have, different chapters or branches in different countries have the ability to really together collectively move towards something. And that's fascinating. And I have seen those forms of community be incredibly effective. And so in that sense, they're the solution. And then I would argue that by and large, the ways that our international geopolitical system is set up, we are still privileging countries that hold power and have held power, and many of whom acquired that power via colonial era practices. And I think in that sense, for these countries, the ways that the nation state is constructed, it is not in their interest to relinquish that power to build in the ways that would be necessary for the meaningful creation of an inclusive community, an inclusive global political community. So no, I don't think necessarily some of these larger institutions are equipped in their fundamental purpose to build these communities, and are actually oftentimes pushing us further apart. Now, I think there are ways that we can hold them to account. Our governments do work for us, and we should make sure that they are working for us in the ways that we would like them to as much as possible. And so we can try and change foreign policies. We can try and push things to change the nature of those interactions. But I do think we have to be realistic and recognizing that first and foremost, the aim of most of our countries is to promote their own interest overseas. And that is fundamentally the promotion of your own interests over the interests of anybody else that you're trying to build a community with is fundamentally going to be antithetical to the creation of a community. So that's a non-answer, but it's a both.
I think you're absolutely right. I think to the extent that the international community is part of the problem, we can say that it must be part of the solution. And I think that we also maybe get into a point where we need to, as you're attempting to do, Shannon, to break down and see what and who the international community is. Because I think for a long time we have framed this as obviously the intergovernmental spaces, as well as the huge NGOs and funders and so on and so forth. But to some of the previous question, there is individual agency within that structure. And I think unless we're breaking this down, it's so overwhelming. And Pauline, to your question of what are the practical things people can do, it is not breaking it down seems like something that is insurmountable. And it is. When you are on these spaces for policy advocacy, whether it's an OECD space or an African Union space, it's so overwhelming. And I've always thought, how would my poor auntie in the village, how would she engage this? It's so removed from her. Her member of parliament goes to these meetings, there's no feedback to her. It is so broad. So yes, they're implicated, but the way that we can hold them accountable and be sure that it's when we begin to break it down and individuals are seen, and we need to see the individuals and different agencies within it. And so to that extent, there is hope, but there won't be hope unless part of what we do as individuals and small agencies keep these hugely conceptualized organizations on their toes. And coming back to perhaps the spaces, whether it's educational institutions or religious groups or faith-based groups, I think this hands-off disconnection from what we call in politics should change. And it comes to the question of, do you care about your community? Do you care about your neighbor? If you do, and the British government puts out something and your school or educational institution can say a thing, they must say it. We don't have enough voices in the space. And those who do the advocacy, it's tiring and you get burned out. And unless renewing voices are coming and energies are coming, I've seen so many senior colleagues in the field who've just gotten burned out and gone to, somewhere, take their pension and go to some island and rest, or go to the village and do some farming. So I guess the point I'm making is that, yes, the international community has responsibility for this, but within it is, beyond the institutions that we see, who definitely must make commitments. I mean, and we're talking about governments, but there are other institutions that are very powerful, the IMF, the World Bank, and regional groups, the European Union, and so on and so forth. So those are all agencies that must act. But I found that unless ordinary small groups are acting themselves, even our moral right to call people to order becomes quite weak. So that would be my addition to that.
Thank you very much. And we are nearly out of time. So I'd like to conclude this session. And I think, first of all, say thank you to both of you for such a rich sharing of your understanding and your ideas, and some really challenging, meaty things for people to think about. And certainly, I think what you both are saying, there are not enough voices in the spaces, wherever they are, from grassroots right up through to governments, regional bodies and international bodies. And it can be difficult for people to actually feel that they have a right, or that they should say things about so much of the aspects of building inclusive communities and the inequalities that people face throughout the world in different ways. So perhaps one of the key messages is, think about what you can do as individuals in your organizations, within your religious communities. If you belong to religious communities, how can you challenge your member of parliament or member of Knesset or member of Congress? And basically, in the end, we have a role. I think this is the message you're saying, to actually be active and participate in this issue. So once again, thank you so much for joining us and agreeing to talk to us and discuss these concepts and ideas. And certainly thank you very much to all the people that have attended this from various places, near and far. And this will be, it has been recorded, it will be on YouTube in the next 3 or 4 days. And please remember, once you leave, you should get a brief questionnaire, and we'd be very grateful for you to fill that out, return it to us, so that we can see how we need to develop and enhance, and all sorts of fascinating things that we can do with webinar, because definitely it's going to be here for a while. So thank you very much, and have safe journeys, and enjoy evenings or lunches or breakfasts wherever you are. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Pauline.
Bye.
Thanks, Pauline. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.